most of what's daunting about it is what we don't know. Economists are really fond of looking ahead. They concentrate on what they do know. They scoop up every bit of data that they can find on the past. They run it through various statistical analyses, and they make projections. So, for example, in the 1970s, they all projected that we would immediately see $100 a barrel oil. Lots of people and lots of regulators made decisions on that basis. Very bad things ensued. So, when you're looking ahead, the thing you need to deal with is uncertainty. Different kinds of uncertainty. There's just plain ignorance, things you could have known, but you didn't. My favorite example is a friend of mine who was hit by a bicycle. He was walking in Boston. He came out between two parked cars. He knew there were no cars coming on the street. He stepped out and he was nailed by a bicycle messenger. He could have looked left. He could have looked right. The reason he didn't look anywhere is because he was talking on his cell phone. That's why, one of the many reasons I'm not entirely in love with my cell phone. But that's simple ignorance, you know. If he'd put down the damn phone and looked, he wouldn't have been hit by the bicycle. Then there's surprise. We were really fond of our air conditioners. We had absolutely no idea that the gases that were used in the air conditioners and the other refrigeration units were eating the ozone layer. If it wasn't for one chemist at MIT who just worked like hell and was a fairly good chemist, we wouldn't have known. You know, South America could have been fried before we found out. That's surprise. There are other surprises that we've had. I can leave it to you, perhaps, as an exercise to think of a few. But there are many things we didn't expect which all of a sudden are upon us. Many of those political developments that I talked about are things that no one was expecting. I don't remember before the so-called fall of the communist governments in Russia any bulletins 5 years earlier from the CIA saying, "Attention, Russia about to collapse, switch to a different form of government, switch to a different economy." I don't recall seeing that in the New York Times headlines. Not until it was just upon us. Surprise. Then there's volition. Not only can surprising things happen, but they can occur simply because we decide to make them occur. All sorts of political decisions fall under that rubric. So when you look ahead, you have to deal with ignorance. There's what you know, but there's also a lot you don't know. There's plenty of stuff you can't know because no one's thought of it yet. And even if you could think of everything, people might fool you because they do something different. There'd be surprise. So a strategy which tries to figure out what's going to happen and just play it out, it's either going to be simplistic or incomplete or in some one of many different ways unsatisfying. So you need a different strategy. You need scenarios. Now, before I leave this slide, I just wanted to say one thing about it. When I first started giving this talk years ago, was back when I used to have these transparencies. And so I put this thing on the projector, and someone saw this slide. Immediately the hand goes up. The question was, did you spill something on this slide? What's all of this stuff? Looks like something ran, like Pepsi-Cola ran over the slide. It's not Pepsi-Cola. It's still here. When people talk about branch points, when people talk about how the future comes up to a certain point and then different things are possible, they have a certain picture of the way to represent the past and the way to represent the future. They usually have a single line up to the point of division and then a few simple lines coming off it. Here I'm going to suggest to you at various points in the talk that that's not a good way to think about things. It's not a good way to think about the past, and it's not a good way to think about the future. I'm just going to leave that for now and come back to it later. I have to say, by the way, maybe this is tempting fate, but the computer gremlin's been pretty good today. Nothing terrible has happened with the computer yet. Okay, so what's the scenario? Well, it's a story. Basically, the best way to talk about the future is the oldest way to talk about the future, which is to make up stories. So, what makes a good story? Well, it's interesting, it's well organized, it presents all of the things that you think are relevant to the future. It has a kind of coherence, and it has a kind of correct scope for what you're trying to think about. Here we're trying to think about the global economy. So, what's new here? The only thing that's new is that the story is told with numbers as well as a narrative. And it tries to be really complete. So this picture is meant to suggest to you all of the different strands or ideas that need to be wound together to produce a reasonable scenario about the future. So one of the things that our organization is well known for is developing a set of scenarios that people have used, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. There are basically three of them. There are conventional world scenarios. These are the scenarios that grow out of the way we see ourselves today, the so-called dominant worldview today. There are really two dominant worldviews. You could call them the English-speaking view and the other European view. Now, people who are neither from the English-speaking countries nor from the other part of Europe, that is France, Germany, etc., might object to this characterization. But it turns out to work pretty well for these purposes. So the first one, the top one, is the so-called market forces world. This is a world in which basically things happen in a fairly market-driven fashion. The global economy evolves in a market-driven fashion. In the policy reform case, it's one where we try to intervene. So who is the we? Primarily government. So if you think of, for example, the differences, say, in the social safety net between, let's pick extreme examples, the US and France. Okay. So the market forces would be the US view. Everybody fend for themselves. France, pretty well taken care of. Excuse me. Now, one of the things that we understand more and more as we go through this recession is that you don't always get what you bargained for. That is, you may think that the world is evolving in the direction of these conventional worlds. You may have pretty good reasons for believing in the short run that you can even tell what's going to happen based on some idea of how the market world works or how policy works. But you can be really surprised. The folks who let Lehman Brothers fail were really surprised. And things broke down. And for a while, I give it a couple of months, nobody was quite clear what was going to happen. It was just unclear whether the global banking system was going to freeze and stay frozen for some significant period of time. If that happens, then different things could occur, both of them bad. One is that people retreat to islands of stability, the fort in the picture. The other is things completely break down. So